introduction and then pass it over to Eric. I'm Eva, I'm the Startup Hub Manager here at Grid Auckland, so welcome. If you haven't been here before, we're excited that you're here, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in this building that you can access. There's a cafe you can work from, there's a co-working space upstairs you can continue to build on your business. There's a whole events program like this that we support. Then there's also advisory services to help you get off the ground with professional advisors, investors, other founders, all sorts of people. So come in, hang out, come and chat if you have any questions. While we're here, just if we need to exit the building for any reason, that's our main entry, and we'll just meet over on the other side of the road. Bathrooms are just directly behind that planter wall where the light is. There's 4 in there. Wi-Fi, if anyone would like to use the Wi-Fi, there's a Grid Auckland guest network, and the password is beammeupscotty, so that will get you on. You can tweet if you would like, so there's a Grid AKL account. Is there a Space Challenge account?
Oh, you mean for the website? Or?
Yeah. Oh, for Twitter? Do you have a Twitter?
Oh, yeah, NZ Space Challenge.
Awesome, cool. That's it really. Grid Auckland is a sponsor of the Space Challenge. We're really excited to be hosting you today, so thank you for visiting us. You're halfway through a national tour of these, so thank you for coming in and spending some time with us. But hand on.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Yeah, well, thanks again as well for everybody who's come to hear us. We're from Wellington. We're from Wellington right now, but we're originally from California, and for me, originally from the Philippines. So I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But again, I just wanted to emphasize that we won't be here if Grid AKL and also ATID, who's our main sort of like local sponsor, has not basically hosted us. So thank you so much for having us. And we're really, really excited to be talking about the first New Zealand Space Challenge. And so to kind of like kick it off, first, I think what we'll do is we'll show you one short video, and this is just to give you a little bit of an understanding in general, a broad understanding of what the challenge is actually working on.
This video was just produced today, so let's see how it goes.
Well, kia ora and welcome to the inaugural New Zealand Space Challenge.
This year's Space Challenge is based on Antarctica. Antarctica is the windiest, coldest, and one of the most isolated places on the planet. And in a lot of ways, it's an analogue for Mars.
It's an incredibly alien environment for a human to be in, and it's an incredible place to test technology and resources that could be eventually used in space. It's about as close as you can get to leaving the planet without leaving the planet, I guess.
This year's challenge is really around solutions to navigate across the terrain in Antarctica.
Anything that comes out of this challenge could be highly beneficial to the logistical efforts in the Antarctic to essentially give us better information about what's going to happen to the climate system.
What we would learn from the challenge can be applied to all the space exploration missions that will go forward in the future.
The whole goal of this is to create an entire community of people that are interested in these kind of projects and share and learn together.
Students, academics, entrepreneurs, tech companies, people who just like playing around with data, anyone is encouraged to think about the Space Challenge.
It's a great opportunity for people to let their imagination run freely and to then take those ideas and really put the theory to practice. And I can't wait to see what comes out.
So just a quick poll. Who has heard about the challenge before this briefing actually went on Eventbrite? Oh, nice. That's great. Yeah. So again, what we'll do is that we'll have like 2 parts to the presentation. First is that we'll talk about more like where we come from, like how this came about, what's the motivation for the challenge, the mechanics of the challenge. And then the second part would be more on the actual problem and why we're focusing on Antarctica as an analog to space. Unfortunately, we invited a bunch of like Antarctic experts, but it looks like the season is that they're in Antarctica right now. But we've actually gathered a lot of information, and Eric's going to be talking about especially the challenges that comes about with this particular problem. So
Unless we have someone with Antarctica.
Yeah, actually, is there anybody who's gone to Antarctica in the room? Okay, so Eric and I have actually been on the peninsula, so not like internal. So we have some idea of the kind of like the environment. But in any case, we'll talk about a lot of the experiences that kind of like we've heard about. So let me start off first talking about where we come from. So we're here. Eric and I are actually part of a team. There's one more guy in California. His name's Richard Bodo, and we're Edmund Hillary Fellows. So the who knows about the Edmund Hillary Fellowship? So it started essentially just last year. It's a really great program for entrepreneurs and investors to come to New Zealand, and also for Kiwis. So it's for both, to work on a really impactful problem that could scale and that would impact New Zealand in general. So we applied. There was about 300 applicants. We got downlisted to like 28. And so we're all over, from all over the world, but we're here to work on a project for New Zealand. And I'll talk about that kind of like in a little bit. But also, let me talk about a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I'm originally from the Philippines. I was born and I grew up there. I actually did not leave until I finished my undergrad in physics. And so for me, when I was growing up, I'm really passionate about space, even if I wasn't really good at math and science and so forth. But for some reason, just by pure sort of determination and maybe stupidity, I managed to go through my whole career of either working for startup companies that are related to space, to working on ecosystems like the International Space University and Singularity University, to work on communities that are focused on either space or technology. And then a few years back, I also worked on a book to talk about like the history of private space flight and where we're going. Eric, you want to give a little bit of your background?
Yeah, let's see. I started in physics and astronomy and mapping the galaxy, and then went into space engineering. Worked on space station design for about 8 years for NASA, and studied space shuttle risk assessment also. Then, and also got long involvement with International Space University. That's how Emily and I met and got married over there. And then last 8 years I've been working with startup companies in California.
So I mentioned that my first passion is space. The other passion is impact. And so for me, I think I'm really privileged to be able to have experience living in a developing world, but also being able to experience on the other side, you know, the best of sort of what the developed world can actually do in terms of technology and like the best sort of opportunities that you can have. And for me, I think that that should be something that can be experienced by everyone. And that's really, if you kind of think about that, so my mission really is to democratize space. And what does that really mean? What that means is for everybody who are not just like, you know, the US or China or Russia, who's now essentially at the pinnacle of like where we're going for in terms of like the space industry in the future. We want to make sure that the rest of the world actually has that opportunity as well. And so I always think about that as the you know, the UN Sustainability Development Goal, which is number 10, which is to reduce inequality kind of like in the world. I do think that the survivability and the future of humanity is actually if we do explore and then also find those resources out there, like, you know, off planet. And to be able to actually do that globally, we want to bring together everybody else. So for us as a team, that's sort of what we have focused on, like the democratization of space. And what we're trying to do here is we incorporated in New Zealand last November a social enterprise that will help hopefully co-create a space ecosystem in an industry here in New Zealand. And we want to make sure that the potential of New Zealand to be a pioneer can actually be you know, used and emulated by other countries around the world as well. So how do we think about really creating a space industry? I just wanted to sort of show our thinking about that roadmap, and it's really it involves like several factors, of which the first thing that you really need to do is capacity building. So today, when we think about New Zealand, you know, it's new. You got Rocket Lab starting, but we need to create the education and the training to have the capacity for people to be specialized and focus on the space industry. And then the other thing is that, like, once you've got that, then you can birth startups and ideas and companies. And then from there, if you can give them the tools and the training, then that increases the percentage of businesses or space businesses to really succeed, kind of like in the future. So, as I mentioned, our sort of like our moonshot is the democratization of space. Our short-term goal then is essentially these two initiatives. So we're taking baby steps. What we're doing is like the two things that we're working on is one is we're creating a space directory. So if you go to spacebase.co, it's right now it's a little buggy. We're still working on it, but we've managed to at least find about 70 companies and organizations already in New Zealand that in one shape or another are working on space. So most people would say, yeah, there's only one company, one space company in New Zealand, it's Rocket Labs. But actually, that's not really true. And I think that is just like the tip of the iceberg. We're still working on finding those entities and individuals. And then the other thing is that, so how do you actually create a community, or how do you create that ecosystem? For us, one of the easiest ways is to create or make the opportunity for incentive prizes. So this is sort of like where the New Zealand Space Challenge came about. And this is not, you know, it's not something new. Challenges have been used many times over in different industries. So for example, if people remember from the early 2000s with the Ansari X Prize, the first private company that has actually gone to space, come back, and basically did it again, which is SpaceShip1. That was done through the Ansari X Prize, where there was they had, I think, about 20 or 30 engineers with only about $20 million in resources, who essentially replicated what, you know, governmental agencies, space agencies have done. So that's one example. Today, NASA normally does the Space Apps Challenge, and it's done all over the world. There's also another challenge that's happening in May on Tech Week. It's called Act in Space. It's being coordinated by the Center for Space Science and Technology down in Alexandria. And so we're also coordinating with them on that. And like, there's other ones like from ESA as well. So why a space challenge in New Zealand? Before we go to why New Zealand and why we're doing this particular problem statement, is that I want to point out first why it's like right now for New Zealand to be a spacefaring nation. So 5 or 10 years ago, this probably would not have happened. And it's because of this rapidly accelerating technologies, what we call exponential technologies, where in terms of computing, the price performance of computing has been doubling for like 18 months or 2 years. And any technology that is based on computing is also going to basically exponentially accelerate the same way. So from AI to robotics, biotechnology, nanotechnology, these are the technologies that are kind of like pushing us forward. And because of this, it has started democratizing space. Case in point here, your cell phone that you normally take for granted is about 120 million times much more powerful than all of the Apollo computers combined to send man on the moon. So if you just think about that, your single smartphone it basically compares to all of that computers back in the 60s. And so it essentially is just showing how technology has changed so much. Here's another example. Today we get our weather sort of reports from big satellites that have been put up there with millions of dollars. And then you also need a ground station that is also equally big and equally expensive to kind of like pull that data. Well, today you can get online a software-defined radio for about 20 bucks. And if you know how to manipulate the software and there's a satellite that is unencrypted that is flying overhead, you can get the same quality of image from that single device. So that's where technology has gone today. It's definitely dematerialized. And so it doesn't matter where you are anymore. Like, I mean, you can be in New Zealand, you can be in India, you can be in the Philippines, and take advantage of all of these technologies. Here's another example. Endurosat is a Bulgarian company. Actually, the co-founder of this is one of our students, like way back in Singularity, just about like 7 years ago. And essentially for them, they have an online store, they have all of the components, you can pick and choose and integrate your satellite, and in 5 days they can deliver the full integrated satellite. We're talking about nanosats here, so it's not the big satellite birds that are in the past. But again, they're a small group that just has smart engineers that basically created their own internal kind of like shop, both software and hardware. So again, just to emphasize, exponential technologies definitely has created new opportunities or new markets within the space industry, because it used to be normally just launchers and spacecraft. While all of these are now in play, and it's not only big, big space agencies or big aerospace companies that are working in this field. It's the 3 guys in a garage can now compete with national space agencies. So one example again is Made in Space. Made in Space is also a team that came out of, they were our students, again, like 7 years ago. And they had this dream of wanting to basically build big, big sort of like spacecrafts and big infrastructures in space. So, for most people it's just, well, sci-fi. But they latched onto one of those exponential technologies and knew how to connect the dots between that sort of like moonshot to their sort of like short-term goals. So what they did was they looked at 3D printing. At that time, 3D printing was also novel. And today it's everywhere. But before that, there was no 3D printers that can actually function in space. So what they did was, that's essentially their tech, is they managed to figure out how to build 3D printers in space by flying them in experiments on zero gravity flights. And then in 2014, you know, they now have 2 3D printers in the International Space Station. So one of the stories there is that one of the astronauts basically misplaced his wrench. And in a typical thing is that if you misplace something there or you broke something, you won't be able to get another one until like the next launch comes up to replace the thing. But now that there's 3D printers over there, what they did is that they basically just emailed the CAD file of a wrench, and the next day when the astronaut woke up, he now has a wrench because they 3D printed on station. So, but it doesn't end there, because again, their moonshot is that they want to be able to create or manufacture big structures from non-Earth resources. So when you go to the moon and Mars, using those resources from there to actually 3D print or manufacture. And so today they actually won a contract from NASA for at least $20 million to actually start working on this. So just for me, it's a great success story, because they were just basically dreaming about this about 7 years ago. And so with all of this exponential tech as well, even the big guys are now leveraging those technology for really big missions. So, you know, with SpaceX, and I put the Tesla over there just because it's freaking awesome. So, like, there's SpaceX, there's Jeff Bezos from Amazon, who are now looking at, you know, missions to Mars, missions to the moon, and those are still, unfortunately, they're still big, expensive missions, right? So where does New Zealand fit in this kind of like big missions? So I was shown this graph. When we talked about the big missions earlier, this is like, it's like the end point of this. So they're still expensive. And then you think about Rocket Lab, which actually has a sweet spot here. Like Rocket Lab is now, it's in a class by itself, because it now has basically given the opportunity for smaller satellites and smaller spacecraft to be launched more frequently, rather than like waiting for those big guys who you don't even know if they're going the same way that you want to put your spacecraft. And so, which is why they're like first in class. But all of the rest, like for these missions to happen, you need like food production, you need you know, life support systems, you need like the habitats that you're going to be putting on Mars and on the moon. Nobody's working on those yet. Or I mean, if they're working on them, it's very few. So that's all up for grabs. I think New Zealand should be looking at all of these. And again, as I was like saying, those big guys are looking at how to get there, the A to B. And so they're looking at the launchers and they're looking at the spacecraft. But what's inside? There's nothing inside at the moment. You can be the ones to actually work on those. So as an analog, today, you know, New Zealand is well known for Antarctic support of research and operations. And so this is like actually a very recent photo. So that's sort of what's happening today. So as an analog, that should be something that could happen in the future. Why not have New Zealand be also the, you know, the specialist for also supporting all of those big missions in the future? So one last slide before I turn it over to Eric is that the other question is like, so why New Zealand? I think I still need to sort of emphasize that there are certain elements to have a sustainable space industry, and not all nations actually like tick the boxes. And if you put that on a grid for the different, at least countries that I've looked at, New Zealand ticks a lot of the boxes. But for one, you have a progressive government that can actually move faster than some others, just like what happened with Rocket Lab, where they managed to move policies and regulations fast enough to be able to make businesses thrive. That's one. The other thing is that New Zealand's isolation is actually its benefit. There's nothing in the east and there's nothing in the south, so which means that air traffic is very low. You can have more frequency of launches, and there's more launch angles to choose from. If you're launching from like Florida, like for example in the US, or say Baikonur, if you look at an air traffic map today, it's just chaos. So, and you'll see that like down here in the south of New Zealand, there's not much. So definitely a benefit.
Is that our main point of difference?
Pardon?
Is that the main point of difference?
That's essentially a big point, for sure. I don't know, Eric, if you want to add. Is there anything else?
And most of the traffic is going to go to polar orbit, so going south is real important. And and you have, but all these other things feed into it. You know, good infrastructure and good manufacturing capability and everything else. You know, people. A friend of mine was trying to launch out of Kwajalein and didn't have the right tool, and it took 6 weeks to get the tool delivered. And so it just shuts everything down.
Could it work out that New Zealand just becomes a launch facility on its own?
No, I mean it's got. That's why you know, we're interested in the launch, but for us, we think there's opportunities across the board for from making small spacecraft and missions to data analysis that can be done anywhere. And so it's you know, we're just identifying lots of capability here, and so it's just having access to launch is added benefit, I think.
Yeah. So you mentioned that one of the big things is the launch infrastructure and capability, which now puts New Zealand on the map, because it's like there's only 11 countries now, including New Zealand, who can actually send payload and spacecraft up to orbital launch. And then there's also educational and entrepreneurial communities where that sort of like building and birthing startup companies could come from. And I think the last thing to point out is I actually really think that New Zealand's culture of exploration just lends so well with kind of space exploration, from the Polynesians and Maoris who've come here to New Zealanders actually helping but Antarctic explorers and researchers as well. And then what's the next step to that is, well, it's space exploration. So, oops.
Oh, yeah. Okay, this is my my attempt at my crude video attempt at a big sweep of things from everything from the last 1,000 years, the Maori arrival, to into Antarctic operations and the launching and future Moon and Mars. It's I don't know if you share this view with me, but to me, thinking about going to the Moon and Mars and asteroids, it suddenly makes all of history alive. It's like you suddenly are thinking about what did people arriving on different sailing vessels come here with? What did they, it's a completely different. It makes all of history a prelude to what's next in this. And in this sense, I've been starting to talk to some people about the concept of an interplanetary waka, with trying to understand the traditional knowledge and how it applies to what we're about to embark on. Because these vehicles, some of these vehicles may be arriving in 10 years that can carry 100 people to the Moon and Mars. And so things are going to happen very quick in transforming our vision of space. So, but to bring us back to the challenge, we're building on the long history, the 60-year history of New Zealand operations in Antarctica, to try to use those lessons